I'm really, really pleased to be here tonight with a woman who was recently cuddling a koala, so you would have no idea of the dark depths in her mind. Paula Hawkins was a financial journalist in the UK. Good career move, you're thinking, sensible. But then the global financial crisis, not working out so well then. So she writes 4 books under another name. The first 3 do okay, the last one doesn't. Suddenly she's looking at some pretty nasty figures. Hi, Dad. Writing a novel. Just need a little bit of cash to tide me over. One bidding auction and a film deal later, and The Girl on the Train is an international bestseller, and Paula Hawkins is laughing, or at least smiling gamely as she ploughs through the next novel. Welcome to Melbourne, Paula. And can I say personally that it is really nice to read a book that uses the word vulpine so well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Did you have a plan B from being a financial journalist?
No, not really. I mean, I always wanted to... Journalism was something I wanted to do. My initial idea for it... I grew up in Africa, and my father was an academic, but also did some journalism, and we often had journalists come to stay at the house, and they often had exciting stories of, covering wars and being kidnapped and all that kind of thing. And I thought it sounded terribly interesting. So I wanted to be the intrepid foreign correspondent telling the truth to the world about all the terrible things that were happening. But actually it turned out that I wasn't really cut out for that because I'm something of a coward. So I ended up drifting into financial journalism and writing about tax and pensions for a really long time, which was fine. It was actually more interesting than it sounds. And but it wasn't, it didn't make my heart beat faster. So eventually I started looking else, I started thinking of what else I could do, and I'd always wanted to write fiction, though I'd never had much confidence in myself as a fiction writer. So it was kind of a long way round.
Well, and did someone take a look at your articles on mortgages and interest rates and go, "You're perfect for romantic comedy. Come and write some books"? How did that happen?
It wasn't quite like that. An agent, read my articles on tax and pensions and thought, "You'll be great to write a money guide aimed at women," which I did. Which I would really, really not advise you to read because the advice in it is terrible. But it was 2004, and everyone was taking out 17 credit cards and juggling them around. Anyway, I did that, and then the agent approached me about writing some romantic comedies.
And that's itself quite a stretch from a money advice book.
Yeah, it was a weird thing because, it's not the way you usually get to write fiction anyway, but an editor at Cornerstone in London had this idea that they wanted someone to write sort of a chick-lit kind of novel set against the backdrop of the recession. So a woman who's lost her job due to the global financial crisis and how she's... So my agent approached me thinking, oh, well, she understands all that money stuff, so she can have a go at it. So that's how it happened. And they gave me 2 months to write it. It was ridiculous. And they basically had, we want these characters and we want these sorts of things to happen. So it wasn't my idea at all. It was, I was given a framework. It was like a journalistic commission, really. And I went off and wrote it. And it did okay. And then they asked for another one and another one. But they left, after that, they sort of left the storylines up to me.
And things went a bit pear-shaped then, didn't they?
Well, not initially. I wrote 2 that did fine. One of them's very big in Germany. But it really wasn't my genre. I'm not, romantic. I'm not romantic, and I'm not funny either. So romantic comedy was just not the sort of thing I should be writing. And they kept getting darker and darker, and more terrible things kept happening to all the characters. And so by the time I got to the 4th one, where we had people dying in all sorts of horrible ways, it was clear that one didn't sell at all. So it was time to do something else.
But it's interesting that you say that, you were too cowardly to go into war journalism and things like that, and yet you're obviously following this thread of darkness that would not lie still.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different kind of, you're following a thread of darkness, but you're not going to be shot at. So, no, I can say, I enjoy actually looking at the darker side of things. I'm interested in how we end up, normal people end up doing terrible things to each other. That's not a very nice thing to say, but I am. You read stories in the newspaper of people who've been living seemingly completely normal lives, and then something has gone wrong, and they've ended up acting in the most extreme and bizarre ways. And it's the unpicking of how on earth did you get there that I find interesting.
Well, I find it really interesting that a lot of the reviews talk about Rachel as an unreliable narrator, which makes me feel that I shouldn't trust her. But actually, I feel like I'm struggling along with her to uncover and understand what's happening. How do you feel about that characterisation?
Well, she's unreliable, but not in the traditional sense of most unreliable narrators are lying to you, I suppose. Rachel's unreliable in the sense that her memories are not reliable. Her judgment, she can't trust herself. But you're with her in that. She's not lying to any except occasionally, perhaps lying to herself the way we all do. But it's more a question of her not being able to faithfully recount what she did yesterday, so she's unreliable in that sense.
Well, and there's lots and lots of constant references to Gone Girl, the other massive thriller with girl in the title. How do you cope with that?
Well, there's lots of things about that. First of all, there are dozens of novels that have been billed as the next Gone Girl or have been lumped into that. So it's quite a common thing. I don't think it hurts anyone to be called that. Obviously, it creates a sort of buzz around your book. I don't actually think the book's particularly similar. So there is a sense in which people might be disappointed if they pick it up and think they're getting exactly what Gillian Flynn wrote, and you're not getting that at all. There are some, I think that the main similarity really is that you have an unlikable female protagonist who, behaves in ways that perhaps we wouldn't expect a woman to behave. But they couldn't really be more different. Amy Dunn in Gone Girl is this, well, she's a sociopath, she's controlling and manipulative, and she's pulling all the strings. Rachel in The Girl on the Train isn't in control of anything at all. She's at a complete loss. So they are worlds apart, actually.
Yes, well, and in fact, everybody's got these really major problems. And I found it that it was almost the men who were least easy to empathise with, even to like at all, even people who, say, lost their wives in horrific circumstances. Was that a deliberate thing?
I think the reason it's probably most difficult to empathise with them is that we don't hear from them. We hear from all the female narrators and we don't hear from the men. And there was the reason for that was that you can't hear from everyone. And if you have to hide things in a thriller, obviously you do, otherwise there's not going to be suspense and there's not going to be mystery. So I chose to make this a book about the women, and the men, to some degree, have to take a back seat. I think there are probably things to empathise with in all of them, but we don't feel it in the same way. And I think, you mentioned Scott, who loses his wife. He behaves horribly at certain times, but I think if you unpick why he's behaving horribly, that his wife is this incredibly restless woman who he constantly feels pulling away from him, and he's trying to hold on. He's doing it in all the wrong ways, the way people often do, but there isn't sort of malice at the heart of that. There's actually love at the heart of that, but his actions nevertheless are misjudged. But I think, so I think there are things to like in all of them. Well, maybe a couple of them there's nothing to like, but mostly there are things to like in all of them.
There's certainly things to recognise in all of them, aren't there? They are very believable characters.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear you say that. That's what I was concerned with, is I think that's what most of it is, credibility. Whether or not you actually like them is something different, but you have to believe in them and you have to care about their problems enough to want to follow them on their journey. Otherwise, you're just going to put the book down.
Well, and readers are really cynical these days, and they're always going, I can spot that twist before it's coming. How hard is it to lay a credible trail of clues but not give too much away these days?
Well, I think if you read a lot of crime fiction, you probably could spot, because there are certain things that crime writers do. So it does become something you can pick on certain ways in which people try to hide things. And in a book like The Girl on the Train, there are only really 6 characters. So you've got one of them is the victim. So you've got a 20% chance of getting it right. It's not that difficult. But I think for me, the whodunit part of it is it's not the be all and end all. As long as you're throwing the reader off in the right ways at the right times, and that's the thing that is key, and that's something that I think is almost instinctive, that you get to a part of the book when you know you've got to feed another piece of information, and whether that is actually a proper clue or a red herring, it doesn't really matter, but you've got to pace that release of information, and that's the thing that's satisfying. And you can get to the end of a book, and I've done it, or the end of a television program, and thought, oh, I was right. But that doesn't ruin it. Well, it doesn't ruin it for me. It actually makes me feel quite clever, and then I want to go back and watch it and see why I was right. So
this is why it's okay to read Game of Thrones spoilers. We were discussing this earlier. It's still going to be all right. Well, then at one point, Rachel talks in the book about how much better things were before email for jealous drunks, because, you left less of a trail, you had less of that kind of trigger ability to humiliate yourself. But how much easier was it before the digital age for thriller writers? Because now you've got to take into account all this technology.
Oh, so much easier. I always manage to make people lose their phones or have them destroyed, because phones are so annoying, because it makes it so easy to try to basically figure out what everybody's been doing and where they are. I think it's why you probably find a lot of people want to now go back and set things in the pre-internet, pre-smartphone era, because it does. It creates a new world, and I know there are plenty of people who write in that digital sphere, who write about Facebook stalkers and all that, but it's not actually something I want to do. So in a sense, The Girl on the Train is a little bit old-fashioned. We're talking about somebody who sits on the train and looks out the window into the houses that she passes. Well, actually, no one looks out the window anymore either. They're all just like going like that. But I used to look out the window, and I still like to do that. So
I was talking to someone recently about romance comics in Australia in the 50s, and apparently there was this whole self-censorship code that suggested that no one should say anything bad about marriage. You had to always present marriage as a good thing, and divorce could never be mentioned. That worked really well, obviously. But I'm wondering if we really like the idea that darkness lurks beneath these seemingly happy marriages now, because, the domestic noir genre, as it's been called, is so huge.
Well, I think it interests us all. Everybody sees, nobody knows what anybody else's marriage is really like. Everyone's marriage is presented in gloriously sunny terms on things like Facebook. And so I think it's interesting for us to wonder about what is actually going on behind the scenes. There is also the more serious and rather unpleasant point that if a woman is ever likely to encounter serious violence, it is usually in the home. It's the women and children. That's where they most often encounter violence. So it's a realist way of looking at these kinds of things as well. But I do think it's a natural human instinct to wonder what's really going on in other people's relationships. Even, I think we've all had that experience when a close friend introduces you to the new boyfriend, and you're just thinking, oh my God, what's she doing? But she's so happy, and it's that kind of, there must be something in this. There must be something good.
Yeah, that inability to separate, what you think from what might be going on. But there's, it's hard to feel happy, isn't it, when it goes wrong at the end? Oh, that's right. Great. The book, it's been compared to Agatha Christie and Hitchcock, though I immediately thought Game of Thrones when I first started reading it, actually. There's this wonderful kind of plotting and scheming going on. There's some really powerful female character moments as well. Anna. But it reminded me a little bit of the film Gaslight, except I felt like Rachel is kind of gaslighting herself in a way. And I'm wondering how much of her doubt is about the insecurities you've given her, and how much of it is a symptom of a wider problem that we have about women's credibility.
Well, I think there is a wider problem with women's credibility. Women are often, dismissed as crazy or emotional or what have you when they complain about something, or they're overreacting, or they're not having a sense of humour. In Rachel's case, she does have a real problem. She has a problem with alcohol, which has completely eaten away at her self-esteem. So it's incredibly exaggerated, her issue with credibility, that she doesn't trust herself. She knows that she's messing up. She can't, so she's starting to lose a sense of herself as a believable person. But I think you're absolutely right that women are often dismissed just because they have an emotion that's inconvenient for other people as unreliable.
And I'm wondering how much has really changed for women if these characters are representative. I mean, there's the stifling domesticity and the sexual boredom and the maternal longings. It's pretty familiar.
Well, I mean, obviously things have changed. Things have improved in some ways and got worse in others. You only have to go onto the internet to see how bad some things are. Things like the maternal longings, well, that's something that's never is inescapable. Obviously, it's biology to some degree, or if not the maternal longings, issues around motherhood at a certain point in your life are pushed to the fore, and there's no way of escaping them because everybody is talking about it, and everybody. Even though the question of whether to have children or not, or how many, or whether to go back to work, all these things are intensely personal, and yet they're treated as public property. By the media, by society, by your in-laws, by everybody who feels they have the right to tell you, what you should be doing and when. So, unfortunately, I think perhaps the social side of it might change, but there is a fundamental issue there about having children, which is obviously never going to go away.
Well, it's almost destroyed Rachel, hasn't it? It's been such a powerful thing for her psyche and her life.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, and for a lot of people, it is a terrible trauma to find yourself unable to have children, and it's not. And I spoke about her feeling it like grief, and I think for a lot of women, it is almost like a bereavement when they discover that they're unable to have children, but it's not treated by anyone else in that way because, well, you didn't have a child, you haven't lost anything. And yet it can feel like, I not from experience, but I know from talking to people, that it can feel like you've lost something.
And your friends with kids go, oh, you can still go out at night. It's like, that's really helpful part. I'm wondering too whether we fetishise children because for a long time women in narratives have been this kind of site of vulnerability. They're often dangers that happen to women are a place where the narrative can turn. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that happens with children too. There's a point in here where it's like a child is in danger and that is a really powerful moment. Do you think that we kind of treat women and children the same way in narrative sometimes?
Certainly traditionally they have been. I hope in this book that they aren't, because the women have a kind of agency that obviously the children don't. But yes, I mean, they are traditionally cast as victim most often, where men aren't, and which is obviously, I mean, if you actually look at statistics, I'm not sure about this country, but I'm sure it's similar to England, where you're actually far more likely to be a victim of crime if you're a young man than anyone else. But the kind of crime that young men fall victim to tends to be rather mundane and, just fights in the street and muggings, and so perhaps not the stuff of thrillers.
The massive difficulty of Rachel's alcoholism was really interesting, and you've said of Rachel, I wanted to write about an alcoholic because I think alcoholics are not the kind of sanitised version we often see on the screen or in books where they're lovable old rogues. That's really a key difference between how men and women are depicted as alcoholics, isn't it? Women get to be sad old tramps and men get to be kind of merry eccentrics, a bit tipsy down the pub, It's quite different.
I think you're right, that generally the alcoholics we see, often in crime fiction, are lovable rogues, having a few too many whiskies and falling asleep in front of the fire, and it's almost like it gives them an interesting part of their personality. When it's a woman and a young woman like Rachel, it's altogether more unseemly, and it's not something that people necessarily want to look at. But more than that, and this didn't have to be about a woman or a man, I wanted to write about alcoholism as I have seen it, and it isn't jolly, and it isn't fun, and it does destroy your sense of self, and it's ugly and often disgusting and just not a particularly pleasant. So I don't, and also very dangerous, and it makes Rachel vulnerable and easy to manipulate, and So I wanted to write someone who I thought looked real to me, not a jolly addict.
Because there are so many of them, aren't there? I was reading recently about a writer who does a technique called gender flipping. So she writes the book and then she changes the gender of the main characters to see whether she's got any unconscious gender bias. And I was going to ask you whether you had some kind of conscious strategy like that, but then I realised that this book is so bound up in the power dynamic between the genders that you wouldn't get
it wouldn't
that.
have worked.
Yeah.
No, there are many things about it that wouldn't have worked, as we've talked about the motherhood, which is, and obviously there are fathers too, but the questions are entirely different, I think, and the pressures are different. And as you say, the power dynamic is often different. So, yeah, it wouldn't have worked gender flipped.
Could you ever read a romance now? Is romance dead for you?
I was never a huge consumer of romances, although I know there are wonderful ones out there. But it was never something that I read a lot of anyway. But yeah, I'm interested in sort of literary fiction about marriage. I read Fates and Furies last year, which Lauren Groff, which I suppose in some ways is a romance, and that's an extraordinary book. So, but I'm less interested in the kind of finding Mr. Right happy ending kind of romance, although I'm not dismissing that, because there are some that are written beautifully and are uplifting and warm. It's just I don't go to fiction perhaps for uplifting and warmness.
Well, Jane Eyre, it's a romance.
Yeah.
With
I'm not
supernatural.
sure about Jane Eyre.
Okay, we'll let that pass.
Jane Eyre's a bit funny.
I was wondering, is there a book that you couldn't go for? We were talking in the back about Hanya Yanagira's A Little Life, and you were saying, I kind of haven't gone there yet. Is there a book that is too confronting for you?
Oh, I'm sure there's loads. I don't like the end of crime fiction that is kind of the serial killer, lots of chopped up, mutilated bodies. And I don't like a horror, but just because I'm a wimp, I can't read horror. So that kind of stuff doesn't really appeal to me. I mean, Hanya Yanagira's, I will read it. I just think you need to be in a robust kind of a frame of mind before you start, because you know it's going to be a difficult book. But no, there are not many things that I would shy from. But yeah, horror isn't my thing. Ghost stories, that kind of thing. And it's pathetic because I don't believe in ghosts, but I do get freaked out, and then I won't be able to sleep with the light off.
What was it like immersing yourself in this particular dark world for quite a bunch of time, very intensively? Yeah,
it was, and it wasn't pleasant really, because I was in sort of an unhappy place myself, and I think a lot of that is in the book and has sort of bled through. But I wrote sort of feverishly for 6 months to get half of it done before I took it to publishers, and it was a very intense experience. I didn't do anything else. I didn't see anyone really. I was feeling very low about myself. I felt, as I've said, like this was my last chance. This was the last roll of the dice. If this doesn't work, I have to go and get a real job, and I didn't want to. So once I sort of saw that, it was going to work, that there was something there, then it started to lift and lighten, and I did get good. It was bought by a publisher, and then the financial pressure was off, and I could breathe a bit again, and it wasn't. And then after that, it was actually not an unpleasant experience. And in the end, it became fun. You mentioned Anna, who's the third protagonist, and when I got to writing her, I was starting to enjoy myself a bit more. She's quite an interesting person, and she's very honest. I mean, she's not very nice, but she's very honest, and I enjoyed getting inside her head.
Well, all the women are pretty sexually transgressive. I mean, they have casual sex, they have affairs, they don't feel guilty about some of their encounters, where people seem to think they should. That's pretty interesting and unusual. And you resist the urge to punish most of them for that.
No, I don't, because I don't think that really I don't think they're wildly transgressive. Yes, the affairs that Meghan has, you can see what she's doing. You can see that she's this restless person. I don't think she's behaving very well in the sense that she's not helping herself. But I can understand why she would do it. And she's not setting out to harm anyone. She's setting out to heal herself, but perhaps not in the way that she might want to. in Anna's case, so she starts an affair with somebody who's married, but she believes that he's mired in this dreadful relationship with this horrible drunk, and she's rescuing him from this good man, from this awful woman. So again, you can see how you would justify this to yourself. And I think it's undeniable that there is an attraction in playing the mistress, and being this, the one that is irresistible despite everything.
Totally. Not from experience. Why do you think we fear the suburbs so much? I mean, in Australia, there's a really strong vein of literature that goes, oh my God, the outback is terrifying, anywhere about 30 k's from the GPO, horrific. And it looks like in Britain, the suburbs are a bit of a problem as well, psychologically.
Yeah, I think that, well, I'm not sure if it's in Britain. I think, have a bit of a horror of the suburbs. That slightly stifling, where all your neighbours know you and are observing what you're up to. And I mean, maybe they don't at all. They probably don't. But that's my kind of idea of the twitching curtains and people talking, and so I can imagine how one could become totally stifled and claustrophobic and just be desperate to get away from it, which is what happens to Megan. Whereas Rachel loves it. Rachel likes that life. She's happy. She wants that domesticity. But for somebody who is restless, it's it would be horrible.
Well, and that fear here, at least, I think, is quite a literary inner city fear, and Megan seems to represent that too. She's the cultured one that kind of likes,
Well, she likes art. I mean, I think Megan is one of those people who's constantly reinventing herself. I think she would like to think of herself as a city person, but she'd also like to think of herself as a traveller and a hippie and all sorts of things. But yes, I'm sure there are many, many cultured people in the suburbs. I'm not being too rude about it.
I kept thinking of Edie Sedgwick when I was reading Megan. Just that reinvention thing is really interesting. It has been optioned for a film out in October with Emily Blunt as Rachel, but if you could have had anyone, who would you have had playing the main characters?
Emily Blunt, obviously.
How are they going to pretend that she gains weight?
I was asked about the casting millions of times before and I could never come up with a good Rachel. It's a weird thing for me that I know who my characters are, but I don't see them necessarily that well physically. I see place better than I see people. I could feel her, but I didn't see her. So I honestly, I never picked her, and I am happy with Emily Blunt because although she is tall and thin and beautiful, she also has, I've seen her doing a bit of Rachel, and she does an amazing job with it because so much of it is how she carries herself. And it's so much of who Rachel is about how she feels herself to be perceived rather than actually what she looks like. It's how she feels people looking at her and her own shame. So if you can convey that, which I think Emily does, that's what is the key thing.
And you can see how there would be some amazing visuals in the hands of the right director because it is so much about being watched, isn't it, and watching others, the trains and the underpass and those wonderful spaces through the curtained windows. Mm-hmm. But you're saying you're very good at visualising place. How's it going to be they've shifted it to the States?
Well, I knew exactly what I was thinking of when I was writing it. It's those slightly sad, tatty terraced houses that you see on the way into Euston or Marylebone or wherever. And in the film now we have Rachel commuting from upstate New York to Grand Central Station past very lovely, beautiful clapboard houses surrounded by autumn foliage. And it is beautiful, and it's also creepy. And I think it's the beauty of it actually contrasts gorgeously with all the grubbiness that's going on behind the scenes. So I think it will work very well. I know a lot of readers are not happy because they felt it as a London thing and they wanted to see it in London. I'm not that upset about it. Well, I'm not upset about it because I do think it will look fantastic, and I think it will add something different, and that's the film is the film and the book is the book. The film is something different. I chose to let them have it and not to retain creative control. And I think they've done a great job from what I've seen, which is not very much more than anyone else has seen.
Well, and it's a universal story, isn't it? It's not a London-specific story.
It isn't London-specific. I mean, that people feel as though that commuting culture is very London-specific. It isn't. But more than that, the voyeuristic impulse, which is really what it's about, is entirely universal, I think. Everybody wants to get a glimpse at their neighbours, or even you can be sitting in a traffic jam and you're looking at the couple in the car next door having a row, wondering what it is that she's shouting at him about. So that is at the heart of it.
It did make me wonder whether Americans won't watch a film that's about poor people, generally. It's like, I want to see the rich people get into trouble.
Certainly attractive people. I don't know. Yeah, I know. I mean, the thing is, it was embraced by American readers, so it's not that they won't read something about it. So I don't know. I don't know why that decision was made, but I'm not unhappy about it.
Well, and I know that you haven't had a huge amount of input into the screenwriting, and you're fine with that. But were you tempted to say, I'd want it shot in Hitchcockian black and white or anything like that?
Oh no, I don't know anything about making films. I really don't. I don't know anything about writing film. I enjoy going to the cinema, and that's about the extent of my experience with film. So it would be ludicrous of me to start making pronouncements. So yeah, I'm happy for them to do what they like with it.
I noticed that one of the people involved in the writing was involved in making the film Secretary. I don't know if you've seen that, one of my all-time favourites. Does that give you hope?
Yeah, Erin Cressida Wilson is the woman who wrote the screenplay, and she, as you said, wrote Secretary, and she's quite sort of left field, feminist, an interesting choice. So I was really happy when they chose her. I
really wanted Jude Law for Tom and Sienna Miller for Anna, but I guess perhaps it's just as well. And I imagine that there's quite a lot more pressure on you now that you're writing the second kind of book under your own name book. What are you going to do? Nip off to the Orkneys for a while? Just pretend it's not happening?
No, it's with the publishers. I've written it. It's taken me a really long time. And it's been a very interrupted process, and which has not been enjoyable for me, because I like to sort of immerse myself in the writing, and I've been obviously doing lots of other things, so it hasn't been the experience that I wanted it to be. But it's with my publishers, as I say. There's probably still quite a lot of work to do over the summer, but in terms of the expectation, there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to get on with it, write the best book you can, and hope that people like it. There's absolutely nothing else I can do, and I know that the closer it gets to publication, the more terrifying it will be. But again, there is literally nothing I can do about that. There is no way of preparing people for the fact that it might not be the same book or the book they wanted or anything like that.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because often you don't get to do the immersive book writing until you're the big name writer, and you're like, okay, back off everyone, I'm going to take 6 months in my villa or whatever. But you did that under the very straitened circumstances to come up with this. Is this what you do now? Is this it? You're just going to do this for the rest of your life?
I don't know. I enjoy writing immensely, and I don't hate the publicity. It's it's a lot of fun. It is nice travelling around. I've got to find a balance, and I'm incredibly fortunate to be in a position where I probably can now, because I don't have to be churning out a book every year or every 6 months. I have some the luxury of time, although my publishers will probably be like, no, you don't. But I feel I have a luxury of time. So I'm in a good position, and I'm very happy doing this now.
Well, and a lot of the writers are comparing you to people like J.K. Rowling and other kind of big-name female writers. Obviously, because you're a woman and have an immensely successful book, because otherwise, there's no Quidditch in this book, is there? It's really interesting how the newspapers are like, what trope can we get to compare her to? I know other successful
so unlike
women.
J.K. Rowling. She's so glamorous. I've been in the same room as her once. She's incredibly glamorous.
Well, she's probably spending the rest of her life trying to live down that writing the book in a cafe on the Dole thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I've got some way to go before I get to J.K. status, I think.
And what's it like kind of thinking, how do you, I guess, present yourself? Do you feel like you have to you're under some pressure to present yourself as a writer, or can you just be you and write books?
Well, I think everyone puts on something of a public persona. Well, you have to be very brave not to just be completely yourself. So yeah, everyone does put on something of a public persona. But it's not a million miles from who one is normally. I'm politer and I swear less. But I think I'm much the same.
Well, and you've said that you're an introvert too, so this must be just a really restful, lovely process for you, the book tour.
It's not nearly as awful as I thought it would be. And actually, doing things like festivals, I've just been in Sydney for the Writers' Festival, is wonderful because you get to, I met loads of amazing people. I met Marlon James, who won the Booker last year. I met Bettina Gappa, who's this fantastic Zimbabwean author. I met all sorts of people. I shook Julian Barnes' hand. I was in the same vicinity as Richard Flanagan for a bit. So it was all very exciting and fun. And I'm not, introverted, I'm not painfully shy, but I'm also not one of those people who's going to get up and do stand-up comedy. So, but most writers, I think, are like that, and there's that quite sharp divide between the writing process, which is sitting in your, office by yourself, tapping away, not talking to anyone, and then having to go out and smile and do the publicity. But if you're a commercial fiction writer, actually most writers, it's part of the game, and it's part of rewarding your publishers for doing a really good job of trying to market and sell your book. You've got to give something. Most people do, and then some people don't. Elena Ferrante does not engage at all, and I have huge respect for that. But you have to be incredibly brave, I think, to say, you know what, no, I'm not doing any of it.
You probably also
need
need
for it now.
Day job or something else. I do want to finish by saying you saw Bill Oddie in Auckland, so not only have you, hung out with Richard Flanagan, but Bill Oddie in a hotel foyer. Did he sing?
He didn't. I just walked past him. I saw Bill Oddie and Gloria Steinem. It was amazing.
It really doesn't get any better than that.
It doesn't.
I was just wondering, to what extent do you plan or map out the structure of your novels before you start the process of writing? Or are you one of these writers who find the story and the characters develop and you sort of start without any particular kind of plan in mind?
I'm a bit of both, actually. I'm not one of those people who can just, sit down and start writing and let the muse take me where it will, because for a crime novel, personally, I need to know where it's going, who done it, and vaguely how I'm going to get there. But I don't like to plan out in sort of very fine detail, because I think that a lot of the fun stuff happens while you're actually in the writing, and the spontaneous, the thoughts that come to you, and the way your characters kind of change for you as you're getting inside their heads. So what I tend to do is sort of sketch it out in a rough draft, and then. But I don't like to fill in too many gaps, because I think, in a way, you're almost telling a story to yourself when you're writing, and it's quite boring if you know everything that's going to happen. So you've got to leave some room for manoeuvre.
Hi, I was wondering, what do you read for enjoyment and inspiration when you're not writing?
When I'm not writing... I read all sorts. I tend to sort of put thrillers aside when I'm actually writing, but when I'm, so that tends to be more literary fiction, and I read a bit of non-fiction as well. I like things like Olivia Lang, Helen MacDonald, people like that. But Kate Atkinson is one of my favourites, and I return to her books often for inspiration. I like Pat Barker a lot as well. People like Cormac McCarthy is a favourite. In terms of crime writers, I'm a big fan of Tana French, she's an Irish writer, writes police procedurals. I'm just trying to think of things I've read recently. The Book of Memory by Bettina Gappa, who's this Zimbabwean author, is fantastic. That's a good book that's out at the moment. I'm currently reading Everyone Brave is Forgiven by Chris Cleave, which is a Second World War book, and I'm a big sucker for war books, actually. So I do read quite widely. I just tend to steer clear of thrillers while I'm writing, because I'm worried that you'll start borrowing other people's plots, unconsciously or consciously. But so I tend to leave those to one side.
Hi, Paula.
Hi.
I absolutely loved your book. I have two questions, really sorry. The first one, did any of the characters stem from any of your personal experiences or did any of their characteristics come from people that you know? And the second question, the Redhead Man. I thought that maybe during the book he would have more of a purpose, and I'm not just sure whether he was there to just cloud the reader's judgments. I was just wondering what his purpose was.
Well, the Redhead Man, I think, in addition to being a red herring, is sort of, kind of, is like the blackout personified. He made flesh. He sort of sums up Rachel's problem with memory in a character, because she knows that she knows him, but she doesn't know why, and she doesn't know how to react to him. So he's sort of a very kind of physical sense of what her problem is and why her problem is so damaging is in her relation to this, because she doesn't know how to treat him. She doesn't know whether she can trust him or not trust him. So he's very much kind of the blackout made flesh. He's also there just to confuse the reader as well, and to take you down to lead you down a garden path. In terms of the characters, no one comes from any one person, and I'm not Rachel, in case you were wondering. But there is a lot in Rachel's. When I first moved to England, I was really lonely, and I was always travelling in and out of London on the train, and there was a lot of my loneliness from that era. Not now, I'm fine now, but at the time, that sort of urban alienation, that isolation that you feel when you move to a big city and you don't know anyone, and you really, really would love to make a connection with someone, and everyone around you seems to be in their little friend group and busy and doing stuff and having these wildly exciting lives. And that disconnection that you can feel, and it's so sharp, I think, when you live in a big city and you're just surrounded by people, but you can't kind of touch any of them. So there's that, there's some of me in that. We talked earlier about the issue with infertility, and I know friends who've suffered through that. So that Rachel is not that person, but I've taken, you sort of steal bits of things you've observed in other people and put them into others. But there's no one that is recognizable. There's no one who is one person. One of my best friends said to me, Kate, to whom the book is dedicated, actually, she was like, she read it and she said, I really like it. She said, but am I the flatmate? Am I Kathy? I said, no, you're not.
I wanted to quickly ask too, I mean, you moved from Zimbabwe to London when you were 17. I mean, that's such a formative time. Did that change you, do you think? Did that leave a mark?
Well, I think it gives you that outsiderness. If you have moved and you are lonely, so anyone who's moved around a lot or who's lived places where they didn't know anyone, I mean, some people will probably just make friends straight away and be totally happy, but I didn't. It took me a while. And so it gives you a feeling of otherness, which in some ways I think a lot of people embrace and makes them feel special. But it also means that you may be slightly sitting apart and watching rather than taking part. And I think I am that sort of person. I do sit aside and watch rather than taking part.
And do you think of yourself as a Londoner now?
Yeah. I've been there a really long time. So yes. Londoner rather than British kind of thing. So, but though I am now, I have a British passport.
We've got time for more questions if there are any. Yep.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for coming out and speaking to us tonight.
Thank you.
I was really quite amazed at how you looked at your character, your main character, Rachel, and how you were really brave to write about a main character going through her trauma and going through her experiences. And often we look at archetypes, and especially the way women are portrayed in stories, and creating a character that was someone so out of control, and the alcoholism, and often with women we don't like to associate that with women, and I thought it was a really brave thing to do. Were you worried? I love the fact that you did that, because I think it's a very brave thing for you to write about, but were you worried that readers would not like that, because it's not something we generally read in the main character?
I honestly was never really particularly worried about it, because I didn't, when you're writing something and you don't even know if anyone's going to read this anyway, but I believed in the character. I'd sort of been thinking about her for a long time because I'd sort of come up with another idea for a crime novel a few years earlier, which had never come to anything. But it had this character in it, this woman, not exactly Rachel, but similar to Rachel, a woman who drinks and has memory and has blackouts. And I sort of started developing her quite a while back. So I really knew her when I started writing her for The Girl on the Train. And so I felt that her voice was authentic, and you didn't have to like her, but as long as I did believe that as long as you felt that she was real and you were interested enough in her journey that you would go along with it. And people do hate her. Some people have said, oh, she's vile, she's awful, she's horrible. And I don't feel that way about her. I think she's sad and I feel sorry for her. But whether or not people would like her or not, or would want to look at her, it didn't bother me so much in the writing. I think it's one of those things you just sort of, you don't even think about it while you're doing it. It's only afterwards when people point out, oh God, she's awful. And I was like, no, she's not. I like her.
Did you think about what happened to her after the book? Do you imagine her life going on?
I don't, although obviously people ask that question. For me, when I'm finished writing, I do kind of just put them aside. But people have asked, and now I wonder sometimes what would happen if her and Anna met up sometime in the future. But yeah, no, I don't really. I hope that she's doing fine.
Any more questions? Yeah.
No, there's a
microphone's right there.
Hi, I was just wondering what your process was when you finished your first draft. How do you then go about sort of finessing your novel, as it were?
Well, it goes to an editor. So, yeah. I think my agent probably read it before it went to my agent's. I love my agent, she's fantastic, but she's quite editorially involved. So she always insists on seeing everything before it goes anywhere. But then I had my editor, I sent it to her and she read it and she was like, oh, I love it, it's fantastic. And then sent me 16 A4 pages of notes. So I flew into a terrible rage, which I always do when I get notes. And I have to sort of go away and calm myself for a few days and then look at them again and realize that actually she's right about everything. So if you're fortunate enough to be in my position, have a publisher, have an agent, you get someone else to help you with the finessing. And I do think it's a real problem, it's a real difficulty for people who are just writing by themselves and haven't got to that point yet, that when you're trying to edit your own work, it's really easy to sort of get stuck inside your own head and go round and round in circles. So I always suggest to people that they find someone, that doesn't have to be professional, but someone they trust and someone whose opinions on fiction are perhaps similar to theirs and who's in the same sort of vein, to try and read their work and see, because it often takes somebody else to point out to you, like, well, that is working, but that isn't, and that's the guy that needs to go if this is going to move forward. It is really tricky to do on your own.
How much did this book change between drafts?
Not hugely. Well, there was quite a big section in the middle where it was really a pace issue. I think the pace had slackened off a lot, and so there was lots that tightened up, and there was probably some stuff that was thrown out. I think initially also, there are some big changes, I guess. Anna wasn't in it. She was in it, but we didn't hear from her initially. I didn't think about writing from her perspective, and then my editor said, once Megan disappears, then you're just left with Rachel, and we can't just be left with Rachel. We need somebody else and somebody else's voice. So there were things like that. So yeah, I suppose quite considerable. But it was only one rewrite really, and then it was there. It did come quite well.
Was there another question over here? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I've actually got two questions as well. One is my mom suggested the book to me and she read it in the Italian translation. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know if you're involved in any way with your translators. I imagine it was translated also in other languages. And what's the connection? And the other question came to mind when I heard the other question and about Rachel. Did you from the beginning use her alcoholism also as a literary device so that you could exploit the blackouts to hide certain things from the reader and, just exploiting in the thriller?
I think the thing with the blackouts was that initially what I was thinking about was the way in which if you can't remember what you did yesterday, your kind of relation to your actions has changed. You don't feel the proportionate sense of guilt and responsibility for it. And I remember I'd read this story by the neurologist, or it was a case study by in one of Oliver Sacks' books, and he was actually talking about somebody who had a blackout from drugs, not alcohol, but who'd murdered his girlfriend and didn't remember it, and he kind of didn't feel guilty about it because he couldn't actually remember doing it or wanting to do it or how he'd done it or anything like this. So I just thought that was really interesting. So that was where it came from, but then it was also very useful to hide things, to obfuscate. So as a device, memory loss in crime fiction is used all the time. There are lots of books in which that crops up, where people have a knock on the head, or Before I Go to Sleep is another one where somebody who has chronic memory loss, it is used as a device. But for me, I was interested in the way it affects your sense of guilt and responsibility, and that's very much part of Rachel's character. It makes her easy to manipulate. It makes her vulnerable. In terms of translation, I'm not involved. I don't speak Italian. I speak a bit of French, but not well enough to translate a book. So it's a strange thing, because you have to just really trust that your translators are doing a good job. I have no idea what is being said in my book in other parts of the world. And there are a lot. I think there's over 40 translations. They're all over the place. So, I hope it's the same everywhere. I don't know.
What was the most unexpected language?
Oh, there's some really obscure places. There's sort of Mongolia and Azerbaijan and Iran and all. I think Iran was one that really surprised me, because I wouldn't have thought this sort of book about promiscuous women who drink a lot would sell that well in Iran.
Maybe that is one to check the translation word by word for. I found that Rachel's alcoholism really interesting. I was wondering if it was a deliberate way to show the tension within her, because she desperately wants to remember, but she's so afraid of what she's going to find out. And that's such a universal story too, isn't it? We're all kind of at war with ourselves in some ways over our own
and I think
behaviour.
addicts especially, and I think that's why she's so frustrating, because she wants to get better, but she kind of can't follow through on it, and she knows that she's hurting herself. But this is the problem with addicts: no matter how much you know you're hurting yourself, somehow the attraction of whatever it is you're addicted to manages to trump all the consequences of the bad thing you're doing. So it's that tension between doing the right thing and making yourself better and fighting against yourself is heightened with addiction.
We've got time for another question or two, if there are some. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna's an interesting character because she's in denial most of the way through the story, and then at the end she suddenly does an amazing U-turn and becomes aggressive, or she's paying out incredibly. She just does an incredible turnaround.
Well, I think actually Anna is not that far. Well, she's incredibly self-interested. She knows what she wants, and while things are going her way, she's prepared to, she's happily in her domestic sphere. But the second that she feels that things are going against her, she will turn dramatically. I think actually Anna is probably on the sociopathic scale somewhere, the degree to which she is self-interested and to which she will protect her own interests and the interests of her child. You see her at some points contemplating really quite appalling things if she feels that would work out well for her. But I do actually think that's a consistent character trait, because when you think about how she's entered into this affair and the life she's taken on, she is always like that. But it sort of is more stark and extreme when you get her into an extreme situation.
You mentioned that this was your last roll of the dice, so to speak. I'd just like to know, if you were having doubts, how did you manage to overcome those doubts?
Well, again, I was fortunate to have an agent who believed in me and who believed in this idea, because I don't think I would have done it on my own. I was quite desperate, so without somebody pushing me, I think I probably would have given it up. But I mean, there are always points in any book where you despair with it. That, you know, the way you think this doesn't work, this is awful, and when it comes at a certain point in the book, if you've already written 50,000 words, it's a really dreadful feeling, because you think, am I actually going to throw this away and start over? So it's it is an incredibly different thing, and in every book I've written, there's been moments where I've just sat at my desk and sobbed hysterically. But you just, in every one, I've actually managed to get through it eventually. But I think without somebody pushing me, I wouldn't have. I think I would have given up.
Last question.
I was just wondering how that initial conversation went with your agent, that you were thinking of moving from chick lit into thriller, and did you come to the agent with a fully formed idea or a few chapters, or did you just call the agent and say, I'm changing the way I write and going in a totally different direction?
Well, we'd been talking about it for a while, because I was unhappy with the way I wasn't comfortable with the romantic fiction genre anyway, and she could see that, and she was encouraging me. She said, no, I think, crime is probably a much better fit for you. So we had been talking about it for a while anyway, and then I didn't have a fully formed idea at all. I had a bunch of ideas, and I said, I had 3 or 4 vague sort of concepts rather than actual ideas, and I went to talk to her about them. Well, I sent them all to her, and then I went into her office and we sat down and chatted, and it was the somebody sees something from a train window was the one. She said, oh yeah, I really like that. And she said, oh, and you must, you should bring the drunk girl back who you were talking about before, because I'd had the drunk girl, and that drunk girl was great, bring her back. So actually it was when we put the two things together, and it is quite collaborative. I mean, well, for me, writing a novel is a way more collaborative process than you would imagine. So that, yeah, for me, it does tend to be something where I rely on a lot of other influences to actually get it done.
Do join me in thanking her hugely for coming along tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.